All right, folks. Welcome to the VulnWise Show, where we bring you exclusive interviews with cybersecurity experts and thought leaders to help you conquer the chaos of vulnerability and exposure management. I'm Steve Carter, the CEO and co-founder at Nucleus Security, and I'm joined by my partner in chaos, Scott Kuffer, who is the COO and co-founder at Nucleus Security. And I've been looking forward to, I think Scott and I both have probably been looking forward to this one for several weeks now because we both spend a lot of time with analysts that are covering the vulnerability and exposure management space. I have been spending a lot of time recently in the last few months,
Some
and
might say
so
too much, Steve. Some
maybe
might
too
say too
much time.
much.
I'm not sure. And we've got a lot of thoughts and questions on the analyst market and the analysts' kind of assessment of this market. And so, who better to join us than Jon Oltsik, who was the founder of ESG, the Enterprise Strategy Group, for those that might not know. It was a market research firm and an analyst firm that was established back in the late 90s. Jon, he says he's now semi-retired, but I'm not sure that I buy that based on everything I see him doing out there and the way he still engages with the community. Jon consults with cybersecurity vendors. He runs a podcast called the Cybersecurity Bridge and spends a lot of time writing. So, Jon, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
My pleasure, Steve. But let me correct one thing. I wasn't the founder of ESG. I was the founder of ESG's cybersecurity practice. So ESG
Yes.
predates me, but I joined in 2003.
That's right. You go way, way back though. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for the correction there. Awesome. So Jon, you recently posted an article about the best practices for vulnerability exposure management based on conversations that you had with, I think it was like 10 or 12 different CISOs. And I thought it was a great read, and there are a lot of things that I'd like to kind of double click on from that article. So for starters, I read the article, and one of my first observations was that it talked a lot more about non-technical things than I expected, right? Things like documentation and process and culture and metrics and things like that. And you mentioned that some of the CISOs were talking about things like how to incentivize and compensate their teams, which is refreshing because these are really things that I think most people just aren't talking a lot about, to be honest, or we don't hear them talking a lot about as it pertains to this topic of vulnerability exposure management anyway. And it's unfortunate because they're some of the hardest things I think to get right, and they're really what determines if your program is going to be successful or not. So another observation I had was that what wasn't in the article was, or what was missing from the article was any mention of AI. So I guess my first question is, did AI come up? I mean, I have to believe it did, but can you tell us about what you heard and what you believe, at least the AI impact is going to be to the vulnerability and exposure management category, for lack of a better term, in the near term?
Well, so let me start by saying I did not have an agenda when I talked to those CISOs. I let the conversation flow, and the conversation flowed into process and people. And technology came into play, of course, with things like integration of tools and things like risk scoring, and obviously the ability to scan for vulnerabilities, things like that. It really didn't. It really did focus on process and people, and so that really, I guess, that's the gist of the challenge, and also where people are focused on to address those challenges. In terms of AI, yeah, it did come up, but more of kind of a curiosity than any kind of practical planning or practical strategy. Now, all of the vendors that these CISOs have are talking to them about AI. And so the applications look like things like the intersection between vulnerability management and threat intelligence. Can we improve our analysis around that so that we get better, more timely access to very targeted threat intelligence that will guide a vulnerability management program? Things like risk scoring came up. Can we, in the algorithms, do a better job of understanding what an asset is, who owns it, whether it's business critical or not? Is it business critical for the organization or for a particular subunit of the organization? And then how do we risk score based on algorithmic types of inputs, or do we have the ability to influence them with things like tagging? So it came up, but it came up very generally and it came up very broadly. Now, going into RSA, I think that we'll hear more, and I'm sure you Nucleus have plans around this too, but I'd say right now it's a little bit nebulous as to how AI will fit in. Everyone has an idea, but no one's got a strategic plan or is really convinced on any kind of direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we've got a whole lot of ideas, a whole lot of AI features we're testing, but I mean, I can tell you just my personal feeling so far is that with at least where AI is today, most of these things are in the context of at least a solution like ours are kind of incremental improvements, not massively transformational improvements. And to your point, some of it is absolutely nebulous.
I think nebulous is the right word.
Yeah.
To be honest, that's an apt description. We could tell your analyst background is really shining through here for finding the right word for the situation. I do want to get into prioritization here in a moment because you did mention that that came up a lot, and I mean I know that prioritization has been a topic for the entire time I've been doing vulnerability management, and it feels like we haven't really made any progress. I mean, I know a lot of things have happened, and there's been a lot of activity in how prioritization happens, but it seems like the same question that we were asking 20 years ago is the exact same kind of question we're asking now, and we're just applying kind of different constructs to it. And so before we move into how your interviews went with how folks are actually prioritizing today, I want to take a step back and look at the process piece but kind of one more minute, just because it's a very fascinating thing that we see as well. Obviously, we're a vendor, right? And we provide technology. And our biggest challenge is always the processes around our technology, right? It's not actually about Nucleus. It's really about what the organization is trying to do. And so from a process perspective, it seems like that is one area where AI actually could be more helpful in, just keeping policies and things up to date. And like, it's almost like to Steve's point, it's like incremental, less about our tech and less about vulnerability management, more about utilizing this AI technology to do other things around it and almost like general business stuff. How do you feel about that very long-winded statement I just made?
No, I think it's accurate. I think policy updates, understanding sort of best practices for policies, maybe even, I really do believe one of the benefits of AI will be in a kind of a community atmosphere. So let's say I'm a healthcare organization and I'm a Nucleus customer and Nucleus has other healthcare organization. To the extent that we can share information and best practices, I think then it will be helpful. And then of course, automation. If it can be kind of like a driver assist and give me some guidance on how I can automate, or if it can get to the agentic state and automate some of the processes, absolutely. But as you guys know, we live in a world where that's governed and we sell to and we speak to skeptics. And their job is to be skeptical. So I think things will move quickly, but I do see that skepticism there. And I think we'll have some monumental failures along the way, too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're seeing I wouldn't say monumental failures, but I think that that fail fast phrase comes to mind, and that's our goal with the whole thing because we can take something that we've been working on for a couple of months with AI, and then a few weeks later, it's like, okay, now this is obsolete because some new AI capabilities come out that has kind of made it obsolete, and now we've got to kind of shift over to that. So it's kind of a moving target at this point. It's really hard to keep up, but yeah, I think I
So
agree
it
with
makes it fun.
Yeah, and I
yeah.
just want to be clear. I'm not saying nucleus monumental failures. I think people
Oh,
people
we
are going
knew.
to trust this process too much, and they're going to
Yeah.
fail. And vendors are going to overpromise or be somewhat inept in their AI development, but promise AI features, functionality, and they'll be the cause of the failure. But nucleus, you guys are good.
No, it's funny. I detected you said monumental failure, and then there was just like 2 seconds of silence, and I could see on your face you were like, oh, they may have thought I was talking about them. That was great. But where one thing that is a recurring problem that we see as well around policies, processes, and all of those things is again back to the prioritization challenge, right? And it feels like it hasn't really changed that much. It's the same fundamental problem we had, just blown up to, maybe 10, 100,000x scale even from where we were 20 years ago. Did you get into any of the details when you were talking to these CISOs, how they think about prioritization in the 2020 in the year 2025? I mean, has it changed at all? Like what are you seeing?
Well, your first point is absolutely accurate. And I'll give you a quick anecdote. The first presentation I gave as a cybersecurity analyst was in Chicago in 2003, and I was talking about vulnerability management, and someone raised their hand in Q&A and said, "Okay, I get that, but we have thousands of vulnerabilities. How do we prioritize?" And I gave them the most generic answer that you could possibly give. And to some extent, that's still true is, well, it's easy to say we prioritize based on the business value of a critical asset, but what if it's not a critical asset, but it's connected to a critical asset? Or what if it's a third-party asset that's connected to an asset that's connected to a third-party asset? So I would say that we're still trying to get our arms around this, and that's what CISOs told me. However, the effort to do so has increased substantially. The support to do so from the board and from the executives has increased substantially. There's more cooperation with IT, at least in the CISOs I spoke to, and the tools are getting better. Now, the problem with the tools are, I guess the summary word would be context. I need to aggregate all this information, and then I have to make sense of it. Is that really all the information I need, or do I have blind spots? And do I have the right context? Like again, going back to 2003, the question is, okay, that asset is vulnerable. Who owns it? Who owns
That's
that IP address?
it's a hard question
And
to answer still.
still, so I think there's guarded optimism that, again, the technology is getting better, and there's certainly an effort to make this happen, to do better. But it's still a black box, man. It's still terrible.
Did anyone mention attack path mapping out of curiosity, pure curiosity?
I did.
You did. Okay.
Hey,
I
Okay,
did,
but no,
but it was
I'm not
sort of in the
surprised.
context
Yeah.
of, do you really understand what an attacker will do? And typically what I heard is, well, kind of, and we're putting more effort into penetration testing. We're putting more effort into red teaming or purple teaming. So again, there's an effort around there, but no, it's still that vague kind of concept. And of course you can skew that as you want to as a technology vendor, not Nucleus. Yeah, that understanding that the path from this asset to my business critical asset, it's important to know that. Getting to know that is still hard.
Right, right. Yeah, that's the way we kind of think about it. And even when you do know it, I think it's still a data point, and it's a data point that can help with prioritization, which is why I asked. But to me, it's kind of helps with the bigger question, I think, of just validation, right? Which is a pretty hot topic in our space lately because of the whole CTEM framework and validation being kind of a big part of that. And at least when we talk about validation, I think I speak for Scott. We kind of at least think about it in terms of the confidence that a vulnerability is a true positive and a vulnerability that can be exploited. And there's a lot of ways to gain a certain level of confidence. If you have a pen tester manually test it, then that's a very high degree. But then you've got automated pen testing, you've got breach and attack simulation, you've got things like attack path 2, right? All of these things to me are kind of data points that can help you build that confidence level and thus validate vulnerabilities, but it's just a very small piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, but I mean, when I talk to leading edge CISOs who really understand this, very progressive, have the support and the resources, it's a system. So understanding the vulnerabilities and the validation does things like it feeds your controls frameworks and your security stack. It is an influence on your detection engineering. It's an influence on how you consume threat intelligence and really hone down threat intelligence to the intelligence that's relevant to your organization. So it really kind of goes hand in hand to a very strong cybersecurity program. And of course, vulnerability management or exposure management, if you will, is a critical element.
Sure, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. Another thing that was brought up, I think it was, I forget which number out of the 10, but one of the best practices you brought up was the at least developing the capability to roll out an emergency patch. And for what at least most people call critical vulnerabilities, I think Scott and I and some folks at Nucleus call them existential vulnerabilities, right? The ones where everyone drops what they're doing, orders pizza, and we're staying here until and working until these vulns are patched. So things like
yeah,
Log4j and other,
exactly.
what are typically
Yeah.
0 days, where you're seeing mass exploitation, where there's a major impact if exploitation occurs, no authentication, RCE, all that fun stuff. And so you mentioned that Some CISOs have response plans that are designed specifically for those scenarios and those incidents, which also, by the way, tracks with what we see with our customers. But kind of going back to this question of prioritization, I feel like when you are trying to determine when to escalate a vulnerability to an incident process like this, it's not always clear. And when we talk to different organizations, everyone has a completely different way of thinking about this. So even with a good prioritization methodology that helps you kind of pick needles from haystacks day to day and figure out what to work on, what you're trying to do in this case is kind of like pick the sharpest needles from the stack of needles, if that makes sense. So from that standpoint, what do you think needs to be true, I guess, for a vulnerability to be escalated to like an instant response type of process? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first thing that I heard is that's not a security decision. That's a business decision. And therefore, we need to educate the business people on what assets we have, and they need to tell us what's critical and what's not. And then we have to come to some agreement as to a response plan. And of course, the response plan should include, because now we're talking kind of grander, like even a cyber attack is like, well, what's the CEO's responsibility? What's the chief legal counsel's responsibility? How do we communicate to customers? How do we communicate to regulators? All that. This should be part of it. And that's really, I think there was a disconnect in the past because this is a patch management exercise or a kind of a vulnerability or exposure management exercise. And now it's being included. Now, how you determine that, that's the black magic again. Does it affect business critical assets? How do we classify business critical assets? Has that changed in the last couple of months? What are we doing on the innovation side that's opening up new avenues to those things? Back path management there. And so if you try to pin down CISOs on those answers, that's where I didn't have consistency. So the article was sort of the 10 things, and there were more, but the 10 things that were pretty consistent across different CISOs where I could, by the third interview, I said, I'm seeing a pattern here. What you're talking about, Steve, is still sort of the art of vulnerability and patch management and incident response. CISOs recognize that they have to be good at that, but it really is an art, not a science.
That's a great way to describe it, I would
I,
say.
I think so. No, it's interesting because, obviously one of the things that we always talk about is how do you build a unified and standard way of approaching your vulnerability and exposure risk in an environment. And, obviously all the best practices are, hey, you want to basically create standardization across an industry. But what we see is that is very challenging to do, not even just because of just the nature of what we're trying to do, but actually because of the dynamics in organizations. So, like I always say, it's like, because what we're really talking about is starting with a threat model. And I don't know your experience, John, but every time I bring up the words threat model, I get like a whole lot of like people freaking out because they're like, oh, it sounds like a big project. We have like there's so many other stakeholders. It's like security's not the only one involved. And it feels very serious to have to go to that level and use a threat model to make something like this happen. And one of the things that we always try to talk about is that a threat model doesn't have to be complex, right? It can literally be as something as simple as, hey, let's do a hypothetical. What would make you be willing to text the CISO in the middle of the night? And if he says, call me in the morning, you say, no, you have to wake up. That like what is that, right? And you can start with just this kernel of risk, and then how do you get attention? How do you get the business buy-in? I mean, you oftentimes the security what's crazy is you might not actually know what the business critical stuff is to the business, and so you have to include all the stakeholders into that process. So I'm just curious if did you see any themes in an approach to how they would get to something like an incident response? Not just that whether or not we need it, but do they start with threat modeling? Is that something that just some people do it, some people don't? Are we just not doing a good job as an industry? What's there? Because this is something I think about probably too much.
I don't think you can think about this too much. So threat modeling, and in my career, and I started in cybersecurity in the early 2000s, threat modeling went from sort of a top of the pyramid, elite kind of Fortune 50 exercise to much greater. And a lot of that was driven by regulations, but no, threat modeling is become much more consistent. Tabletop exercises become more consistent. And then I've seen this cyber ranges being used effectively in that way too. IBM does a great job right here in my backyard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They'll bring in a team from an organization and try to give them as real world a scenario as possible, to the point where they have CEO and they have someone pose as a CNN reporter that says, we've just gotten a story that you were breached and it's affecting this and this and this. What do you have to say? So the more real you can make it for people, and Scott, your scenario is great. Is like, when do you call the CISO or the CEO and say, look, we've got a problem, we need to talk about it now? That's a great way to start.
Yeah. All right. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, it feels like not a lot of people do that, but it seems just I try to use that just to bust folks out of the idea that threat modeling has to be difficult, right? Or it has to be this crazy complex process, because I believe you can get a lot of value out of just some very basic scenarios and say, what vulnerability could possibly ever lead to this situation? And then you look back and you say, actually, it's not about an individual vulnerability. It's about the like specific things about certain vulnerabilities. Like I remember shell shock, right? Like that might have been one that might have hit that criteria. And you're like, okay, well, how many more shell shocks are there? And what about shell shock made it something for us to care about? And all of a sudden you can build something pretty quick. I mean, here we are 4 minutes later and we're already starting to build a plan, just by talking about it. So anyway, I apologize. I get distracted. We love vulnerability management over here.
Sounds like you need some attack path for your threat modeling, Scott. That's all I'm saying.
Steve, don't do me dirty like that.
One of before we get too far from prioritization, another one. So I thought it was interesting, just in general, how all of the or how a lot of these best practices just kind of tied together. At least in my mind, they kind of tied together. And one of them was to create an SLA discipline, is I believe how you worded it. And the way what I thought of when I saw that was like the implication that SLA deadlines, I guess, vulnerability due dates, for lack of a better term, should be accounted for within your vulnerability prioritization methodology, whatever that is. And that's a really interesting one, just because there are so many schools of thought on that particular topic. So, I don't know if my mind went to the right place on that one or not, but I'm just curious, from your research and from what you've seen in those conversations, do you think that remediation due date specifically, and the fact that a vulnerability or exposure is past its due date, should be part of the prioritization methodology? Or that's kind of one school of thought, and then another school of thought is it should just be used for more of an accountability tool and a way to measure and monitor the performance of a program? Any thoughts on?
Yes. So the way I interpret what I was told was that SLAs are sort of a baseline, and they're an established way to at least communicate between departments and measure progress and things like that. So they are baseline. They're followed fairly strictly, but there's room for interpretation. And so when you say accountability, that's it. I mean, we want to have a discussion that says, okay, you missed your SLA. Why is that? And if there's a good reason, and that good reason may be security driven or IT ops driven. So for instance, well, we didn't patch it because we have a compensating control. Okay. Well, now let's document that and let's understand that, and then we may use that to adjust our SLA program. I mean, one of the things that got me, and I've heard, Scott, I've heard you talk about this, is that you look at kind of the standard vulnerability management life cycle, and it's got multiple phases. Every one of those phases is dynamic. It's changing all the time based on the inputs and changes to IT and changes to the threat landscape. You're trying to automate as much as you can, but you still have manual processes, and so you have to go through those. So that's where I look at SLAs, is it's a stake in the ground, but we always have to be conscientious about changing those SLAs to meet our business needs and changes in the technology. And that's what I heard.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think I would tend to agree with that versus some folks we talk to that really have made SLAs and due dates either part of their prioritization or they've just kind of over-indexed on that stuff, where the truth is that the risk of a vulnerability is something that's very dynamic, as you mentioned, right? Threat intelligence is changing all the time. Everything's changing. So to make something like a due date be a primary factor in how you prioritize things day to day, it seems dangerous. I'm a little skeptical of that
Crazy.
methodology, but we see it a lot.
Especially in
But just curious.
compliance,
Yeah.
especially when you're like, hey, we have to mitigate all these things within 30 days for
Yeah, that's
compliance.
exactly where my mind was going. If you think back to like 2006 when PCI first came in, we as security people had to say to the business people, look, do you want good security or do you want compliance? And that's kind of what we're talking about. Do you want SLA diligence or discipline, or do you want good cyber risk management? And that's the decision.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And I've found that there's really good ways to implement SLAs, even from an accountability perspective, and there's not so good ways, right? Like, when at the most basic example, it's, hey, the 30 days critical patch cycle is what it is because that's what it is. And then at the other end, you can get these very interesting use cases where we actually are doing sub prioritization within categories and say, well, critical is actually a different type of critical because of X, Y, and Z factors. Therefore, you might have a spectrum of some SLAs are 48 hours, some are 7 days, some are 14 days, and some are 30 days, all within that critical category. Right. And so there's these different ways to do it, but managing that at scale becomes the challenge then, just because there's so much changing all the time. And it's that horizontal scaling, vertical scaling becomes a giant nightmare for a big organization. So we find specifically that most organizations just don't have the ability to leverage SLAs in a meaningful way for prioritization really anyway, outside of the compliance use case. So I guess that's some good news, is that it really is just a lagging indicator of whether or not your organization is performing the way that you have designed it. So anyway, that's another ramble from me on. I wrote a big blog post on SLAs a long time ago. So you keep hitting on the topics that I care about, John.
Good.
I guess that means you're doing your job.
Trying.
So, I mean, speaking of that, so we are running up a little bit on time here. So we couldn't go through this conversation without getting to ask you some analyst-specific questions that we feel like you are probably more qualified than anybody to answer. And one of those, and I feel like we can ask you this now that you're semi-retired, even though not really retired, but semi-retired, is obviously Steve mentioned CTEM earlier, and some of these other new markets are being defined, right? EAP, and then you look at the magic quadrants and the waves and all that sort of stuff. How well, based on everything that you're seeing, how well aligned do you feel like Gartner and some of these other analyst firms are to the CISOs that you're talking to, in terms of like, does it map to what you're seeing on the ground with all of these different organizations? Like how good or how bad are we going in the right direction? Is it converging into a good state? Like where are we headed?
I think the analysts, especially the leading analysts, do a pretty good job of understanding the market needs and categorizing them in a digestible way. But they're not technicians. They don't have a security budget. They don't have to interface with the CIO or other third parties. And so, I mean, they're probably covering somewhere in the neighborhood of, I'd say, 30 to 50%. And they're giving, the good news is, like a Magic Quadrant, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of them, but they do provide some guidance, subjective as it may be, on what's important and what vendors are in the ballpark. Now, that's a data point to me. You should not use that. Like the whole notion of, well, we'll only buy from the vendors in the upper right-hand quadrant is crazy, because Gartner's just taking inputs from the vendors. There's no hands-on testing. They do talk to some customers, but the customers are reference customers. So they do the best that they can. Understanding, of course, and this is where I can talk as a semi-retired analyst, it is a profitable business. Someone told me, a Gartner analyst told me, and this was several years ago, but that the MQ business alone was a $250 million business for Gartner. Wow. So that's MQs, MQ reprints, any consulting for the MQ, any consulting after the MQ, presentations. So anyway, I don't know how true that is. This was a former Gartner analyst, but so I would say they're pretty good. They're in the ballpark. If you're a buyer, caveat emptor, take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah. So that I love the way you word things, right? You said that they understand the market needs and categorize them in a digestible way, I think is what you said, which I agree with. And so, for me personally, it's kind of a love-hate relationship in a way because we need that, right? There's no question we need that. But, Scott and I both, we spend a lot of time with practitioners, IC, everything from ICs to security leadership and CISOs. And then lately we're spending a lot of time with analysts, and we're always talking about the same topics, vulnerability and exposure management. And one can't help but notice the stark contrast between a conversation with a practitioner and a conversation with an analyst. It's like if you were to listen to them, it's like you're talking about two totally different areas of cybersecurity. It's just really interesting. And so I don't know what that means. It's more just an observation than anything, I
Well, I'll
guess.
give you the dirty little secret about the analyst business is that very few analysts really talk to practitioners. Now, I will tell you from what I tried to do is make that a real big part of my research. So we did quantitative research, we got data, but I always wanted to speak to practitioners, which is why I spoke to a dozen CISOs about this topic to get some really hands-on data. And when you talk to people, you can say, well, what's your biggest challenges? But then you can say, well, why is that a challenge? And that to me, that's more impactful and more insightful than just understanding what the data says.
Right. Right. Just to kind of go one level deeper here on CTEM, since we're here on the topic. The Gartner CTEM framework, it's been around for a couple of years now. I'm hearing more and more of it. Again, I'm not sure if it's because we're talking to more analysts, but it seems like it kind of has some legs. It seems like it's being adopted more and more from my perspective anyway. I mean, and then I know we've got these two new Magic Quadrants coming out. One is exposure assessment, one is adversarial emulation, I think, which the combination of those two supposedly is how you implement CTEM, according to Gartner. What do you think of all of that? Do you think that these new Magic Quadrants, do you think that's the CTEM framework? Do you think that all of this is helping? Is it making a difference? Uh, does it have legs? Because sometimes these things come out and then, a year or so later, they just kind of dissipate and everyone forgot the buzzword. But it doesn't really feel like that's the case here to me anyway.
I think CTEM is useful and helpful, but I also think it's nothing new. I won't bore you with the details, but I came up with my own acronym that was basically CTEM back in like
You got to
2018.
tell it to us now. Come on.
So it was SOPV, and it was security, observability, prioritization, and validation. And basically, so it took the whole vulnerability management, threat intelligence, threat modeling, red teaming, purple teaming, and validation, like I say, and lumped those all together and said, these are all the components of cyber risk. And no one ever used in fact, I stopped using SOPV. But then CTEM came out and I said, they just came up with a better acronym. And Gartner kind of has a monopoly on naming stuff, with a few exceptions. So it's it really is good, and it does kind of capture all the elements and puts them into that digestible framework. But you guys know, if you go back 20 years and you talk to people who really understood this stuff, they were doing it back then. So maybe it's just um, educating the market at large.
Yeah, I can't count how many times Scott and I have said CTEM is nothing new to people in the last 12 months. I mean, that couldn't be more true.
Mostly to the analysts that made it up, but that's a I don't know. I don't know. I
You got to
can't
get them
say
on
that.
our side, Scott. You got to
That's
get them on
true.
our
I
side.
know. I know. We like it. That being said, we like it. It's just it doesn't mean
No,
that it's super innovative.
right.
The way they put it together is digestible and it's great. I actually have given multiple talks about CTEM and why it's valuable to the industry, so I'm a big fan of it. But like I said, like even the whole concept of reframing of vulnerabilities and exposure, I have trouble with, right? Because if you look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of a vulnerability and a weakness as we knew it before, or a vulnerability and an exposure, they were basically referenced the exact same kind of thing. So but at the same time, we've had a branding problem in the
Yeah.
vulnerability management space, right? The fact that we call scanners vulnerability management tools at all when they don't really manage stuff, they let you manage scanners and discovery. So, I think that it's needed, but I don't have to love the fact that we need it at the same time.
I totally agree, but Steve, your point is good. I mean, a few years ago, we were calling this or calling a similar category risk-based vulnerability management. Okay, that's still relevant, but what Gartner does is they kind of stepped on that, superseded it with CTEM, included some other things. Okay, but at a certain point, we're educating the market. At a certain point, we're confusing the market. So we just have to be sensitive to that.
It's all right. They're going to
Absolutely.
include AI into it. And it's going to be CTEM. It's going to be great. It's the next iteration. I'm
Don't
calling
give
it
AI
now.
is
anyone any
coming, baby.
don't give anyone any ideas, Scott, please.
Oh yes, we know all the Gartner analysts listen to our podcast on purpose.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Definitely.
Hi, Gardner.
Sorry. But anyway, with that, that's what a great way to end. John, we always like to give our guests the last word. We know that you have a podcast. We'd love if you tell us just a little bit about what you talk about and where people can find you.
Yeah, well, I'll be at RSA, so look for me. Actually, I'll be on Broadcast Alley doing videos with SiliconANGLE and theCUBE, so look for me there, and maybe I can get you on camera. My podcast I'm really excited about. It's called the Cybersecurity Bridge, and we've had 4 episodes so far. They should be on your podcast du jour site, but they're definitely on YouTube. But the format is that each episode is broken into 3 sections. We talk about the present of a particular security topic, so it could be vulnerability management. We talk about the future of that topic, and then the cybersecurity bridge is how do we get from here to there? So do we need new technology? Do we need AI? Are there regulations that will get in the way? Do we need budget? Do we need cooperation from developers or from IT ops? And so it's a lively discussion. We try to keep it entertaining and fun, but hopefully it's useful and educational as well. So that's what I'm doing.
All right, great. Yeah, well, John, we very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to the VulnWise Show. We always appreciate the expertise that you bring to the table, and obviously we'll love to have you on again in the future as you come out and talk to more CISOs and come up with even more interesting insights as time goes on. But with that, everybody, that concludes this show's episode for the week. And thank you so much for tuning in to the VulnWise Show, everybody. We hope you found this discussion fun and insightful, and we tried to keep it exciting for you as well. And as always, follow us wherever you get your podcast, and you can find us on YouTube. We'll see you next time.